Hey friend, today I have a tool tutorial for you that is one of the most requested tutorials, not only in all of my YouTube comments, but also a few weeks ago I asked my Instagram audience what tool they wanted me to demystify, and their answers were router bits, a table saw, which is coming soon, but pretty much routers was the most requested. So today, let's talk about the routers. And I totally understand that routers can be intimidating. I remember when I first decided to start using a router, I was so overwhelmed with all of the things that needed to be taken into account, or all the settings and the bits. But the truth is that it's not really as complicated. So today we're going to dive into all things routers. But if you are new here, I am Annika and I am here to demystify DIY and inspire and empower you to build all the things. And if you are just getting started with power tools and woodworking, be sure to grab the Power Tools Simplified Guide in the description below. Now let's get started with routers. First off, a router is a power tool that is basically used to route out wood, which basically means you're creating grooves in wood, and you can use it to trim and shape wood. There are so many uses that you can use a router for. Some of the most common ones are to create a decorative edge, to create joints like mortise and tenon joinery, or even dovetails. We will dive into all of these applications in just a little bit. So now here you see we have a bunch of different types of routers. So there are basically two types of routers. One is what is called a fixed base router. So this is a fixed base router where this base of the router is fixed. It does not change or move in height. So this router you can only use on the edge of a board. You cannot start with this router in the middle of a board. If you want to start something in the middle of the board, you want what is called a plunge router. And this is actually a plunge router base. My router comes with both bases, so I can just take this motor out and put it in here and use the plunge router. This is the heavy duty router. This is the big regular router. It is actually a wired router, so it's extremely heavy duty and it's great, but it's also super heavy. On the other hand, we have this router, which is a compact router, and this is also called a trim router, which is super lightweight, but it's also not as heavy duty, but it works just fine if you are just getting started, if you want to just add some decorative trim around a board or a tabletop. This is a great starter router. So in this tutorial, I am going to be talking mostly about the trim router or the compact router. Almost all the settings and functions are pretty much going to be very similar across the different routers. Obviously, they vary by your brand type, so you definitely want to check your user manual to find the exact setting that I am referring to. But let's get started talking about the trim router. All right, now let's talk about the parts of the router. So this up here is the base of the router, or the base plate. And this is what provides the stability and the guidance during the operation of the router. And it's usually made of clear plastic, so you can actually see what's going on inside there when you're actually routing out your project. Now in here is the motor, which is basically the heart of a router. And in a trim router, the motor is less powerful than that of a regular router, but this is good enough for small precision work. Now in here is what is called the collet. And this collet is basically the sleeve that holds your router bit in place. And the size of the collet, or the diameter of the collet, basically defines the type of bits you can use. They can be 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch for trim routers, and can go up to 1/2 inch for regular routers. And in here, there will also be a spindle lock button. So essentially you want to press that and then rotate your collet and change out your router. So when you press that, it basically locks the spindle and keeps it from rotating. So you are able to add in the bit and tighten this, and usually you will have a wrench that will come with your router that you can use to tighten it in. Most routers will also have a speed control, which is very useful in allowing you to work with different types of materials. And then we have the height adjustment, which is the most crucial part of operating a router because you want to get the right adjustments for how deep you want to route or cut. This is usually a combination of a clamping mechanism like this that you can open up and make some gross adjustments, and then you have smaller, finer adjustments that are usually made by a small set screw or a ring like this one. And then of course you have the on-off switch and a battery port if you have a cordless router, or if you have a corded router you would have a cord. Now before we start using the router, let's talk about the most important thing, which is safety. Now, like with every power tool, you want to get started by taking a look at the manual and getting familiar with your power tool and taking a look at all of the safety guidelines. As always, you don't want to have any loose hair or jewelry or clothing, and you definitely want to use hearing protection because these routers are loud and they create a lot of sawdust. So definitely put on the airway protection and eye protection. And anytime you are using the router, be sure to use a nice stable surface. So make sure your workbench doesn't wobble and there is enough free space around for you to move around freely so you're not bumping into stuff. And you definitely want to make sure that you clamp your board or your material really, really well so it stays stable and you can pay attention to what you are doing with the router. Now, in terms of using a router itself, the number one thing you want to make sure is that you have a nice sharp bit, because a good quality sharp bit is going to give you the best possible result. The routing is going to go smoothly. If you don't have a sharp bit, it can get stuck on the wood and it can actually also send the bit flying off, which is extremely dangerous. Also, as you're using this, you want to make sure you pay special attention to the direction that you are routing in, if you're going clockwise or anti-clockwise. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit when we actually use the router. Obviously, you want to keep your hands out of the path of the router itself. Now, let's talk about the operation. Let's talk about router direction, which is one of the most important concepts for safely operating a router and getting good results. Because if you don't go the right direction, your router is going to start getting stuck, you're going to get burn marks, and it can also send the bit flying, which is something we definitely do not want. So the router direction, or the direction that you use the router to route out, should be opposite the bit's spin direction, which is usually left to right. So if you are routing out an inside edge, you want to make sure that you go clockwise. And if you are routing an outside edge, you want to make sure that you go counterclockwise. And if you follow this general rule of thumb, you're going to get the best results from your project and safely. Let's talk about router bits. I remember when I first got my router and I wanted to go buy a bit, I went to the store and I looked at the wall of bits and I was so overwhelmed and so confused. I did not have a specific project in mind, so I kind of just wanted bits. So I ended up getting a pack of bits, and over time I realized that this is a pretty good starter pack. It has a little bit of everything, but it isn't the best quality, and quality with router bits makes a huge difference in the quality of work and the efficiency with which you can work with it. So over time I have been sort of replacing some of my most used bits with much better quality bits. So if you are just starting out, I will tell you a few bits that you can start out with, and I highly recommend splurging on them and getting a really good quality one, because they will last for a long time and they will also give you good results. So now let's talk about the different types of bits and exactly what they do. So let's start with some of the most basic bits. This one here is a straight bit, and what this does is it cuts into the material and creates a dado or a groove, and the base of that dado is square, and it's great for basic mortise joinery, shelving, drawers, trimming, plunge cutting, and even decorative inlay. And then you have what are called V-shaped bits. This is actually a brand new bit and it has a rubber coating on it to protect the edge, but this is a V-shaped bit, and this basically does exactly what the straight bit does, except that the bottom of the groove is going to have a V shape. So this is great for sign making and lettering and decorative inlay work. And you can also get a bit that is a round nose bit, which is basically the same thing. It creates the groove, but the base of that groove is round or curved. And then we have a rabbeting bit. A rabbeting bit is actually very, very useful. I use it all the time for putting things like the backs of the bookshelf or adding glasses to doors. And I use that a lot, and that's why I bought a better quality rabbeting bit. And this one actually has a bearing on it, and this bearing helps you ride the bit along a template or the edge of the board. And actually you can get different size bearings, and the size of the bearing basically determines the kind of step that you are creating. So this is extremely useful. I highly recommend you get one of these. And then you also have what is called a flush trim bit, which is this one right here. And once again, this has the bearing on it, so it rides along a template, and you can flush trim another material to that template. And once more, I did end up getting another flush trim bit, which actually has a bearing on both ends, so I can use the template on the top or the bottom, whatever way I want it. So this is a flush trim bit. And you can also get these dovetail bits. I don't use them very much. I have never used dovetails, but they're here if I need to. And then let's talk about the decorative bits. These decorative bits are essentially to create a decorative edge on your workpiece. So you have different types. You have a round over bit, which is right here. It creates a rounded profile for countertops or tabletops. You can also have chamfer bit, which is this one right here, which basically creates that bevel or chamfer on the edge of the material. Or you have these molding bits, which create nice, pretty decorative edge on your boards. So if you were to ask me which bits do you really need to have to get started, my answer to that would be you need at least one straight bit. So a bit like this one. And I think a 3/8 inch bit or a 1/4 inch bit is a good starting size. As you find the need for more bits, you can always add to it. Then you definitely want to have a rabbeting bit with different sized bearings to give you a little bit of flexibility. And you probably want to have a flush trim bit, because that can be very useful, especially if you're making things like cutting boards, etc. And then in terms of the decorative edges, it really just depends on what you need for your project. So I do not recommend starting out with a set. I recommend using the budget and buying good quality bits as you need them. So get started with these 3 bits, the straight bit, a rabbeting bit, and a flush trim bit, and add in as you go and as you find a need for your projects. All right, now let's start using the router. The first thing we want to do is we want to pick the bit that we need. So the number one thing you want to make sure is that you match the shank of the bit, which is this part of the bit that goes into the router, to the collet of your router. Second, you want to make sure, obviously, that you pick the right bit, the right shape, or this design that you want to create with your bit, and you pick a bit that is compatible with the material that you're using. Now, we are going to load the bit into the router. Now you want to make sure that the battery is removed from your router, or if it's a wired router, you have it unplugged. So now the first thing we're going to do is locate the spindle lock button and press that to lock the spindle and insert our bit into the collet. And then you want to use the wrench that came with your router and tighten the collet. Now in my case, actually, in order to be able to get in there and tighten the collet, I actually have to take out this entire thing, and then I can easily tighten the collet. Now you want to make sure that you tighten it just enough, but do not over tighten it, as that will damage the collet inside. Now that the bit is nice and tight in there, I can put this back on. and I can now adjust the height of my bit. Now the depth of the groove that this is going to create is basically the distance between the base plate and the tip of the bit. And I never recommend making more than a 1/4 inch deep groove or route with a trim router. So we are going to adjust the height of the base plate until we have the right amount of bit showing over here. And it's always best to do a little sanity check and double check if you have the right amount of bit protruding out of the base plate. And if you need to make some fine adjustments to the height, there's usually a ring here that allows you to make those fine adjustments. Now, if you are using a decorative bit like this roundover bit, remember this bearing right here is going to ride along the edge of the board, and then this curved part is what you really want to cut and get that rounded over edge. But this bit also has the straight edge right here. So if you really want a rounded over edge, you want this round over bit to hit the top surface of your board. And to do that, you want to insert the bit into the router such that that round over area is just at where this base plate is. Remember, the base plate is what's riding on the surface of your board. So when you set up the bit in the router, you want to make sure that your base plate is just where the curve of the bit ends. If you were too low, you will have the round over off of the side of the edge, which is not what you want. You want it to be exactly starting at the surface of the board, which is right here. Next up, we are going to set the router speed, and generally speaking, larger bits require lower speeds and smaller bits like this one can be used at higher speeds, but you always want to make sure you check the manufacturer instructions on the speed settings. Next, you want to make sure that you clamp your material or project really well so it is nice and stable. I'm just clamping this test piece right here, and it is out of the way of the path of your router. Now, depending on your application and your router bit, you may or may not need a guide or a jig. If you are using a rabbiting bit or a flush trim bit, they come with these bearings which basically run along the edges of your board or material, and they help you make the cut. But if you are using something like a straight bit and you're trying to create grooves in a board, you want to make sure that you use a straight edge guide, or if you are using a straight bit to cut out a circle, then you always want to use a circle jig, which you can make your own or you can purchase. Now it's time to run the router, but I always recommend that before running the router on your actual project, you always make some test runs on scrap wood. Now I am going to be making a straight cut through this board. I'm basically a dado. So I'm actually going to go ahead and clamp that straight edge to the board. Make sure that it is actually nice and straight. And now I can go ahead and use this as a guide to make the cut. Now, before we get started, we are going to put on all of our hearing, airway, and eye protection. Now you want to connect the power for the router and turn on the router, let it come to full speed, and then set it down on your board and slowly push it through. You want to make sure that the base plate stays in contact with the surface of the board, as well as if you are using a jig, it needs to stay in contact with that. Don't exert any excess pressure on it, just let the bit do its work. And that is it, my friends. Like any other power tool or everything woodworking, the only way to get better at using it is to practice and to actually use it in multiple projects and just get better at it. And I promise you, once you start using the router, you will not find it intimidating anymore. In fact, it will open up a whole wide variety of projects and finishes that you can create. I have the links to all the tools and the router bits, etc. that I used in this video linked in the description below. And don't forget to grab your Power Tools Simplified Guide. And let me know in the comments, which tool you would like me to talk about next. And if you aren't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button because I have a bunch of projects coming up very soon. See you next time.